Some of these surveys that I'm seeing say, gosh, if rates were only in the fives, right? We're here. If we can get seller concessions, we're here. And I believe there's a ton of opportunity right now.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Mortgage Minute. Today, I'm joined, as always, by Brian Dewald. My name is Matt Thomas, and we are going to be taking a different approach to Mortgage Minute today. Brian, we talked about this in our last video. We're going to run some scenarios because I think it's important for people to understand with the rates now primarily about 6.5% and potentially lower, it looks like that there's quite a bit of advantage from what we were seeing at 7.5%, of course. But I don't think even when people hear that, they don't necessarily think immediately in terms of like, well, what would that do to my payment? So that's precisely what we're going to do. And Brian, you've got a couple of scenarios prepared for us. Is that right?
I do. So I'm going to run, this is actually a really fun and easy one for me to look at. So my average loan amount for the last couple of years is right about 500,000. So I thought that would be a good mark to use. Of course, everybody's situation is different. And for the purposes of just running this data, I'm only looking at interest and principal on a 30-year fixed rate. So everybody's situation is going to be a little different when it comes to taxes and insurance and potential for PMI and HOA and that kind of thing. But solely just based on a $500,000 loan amount, what I initially looked at is 7.5% for a 30-year fixed rate, which is what we've seen in the last, X amount of days. It wasn't that long ago that number was there. So at 7.5% on a $500,000 loan, that puts our principal and interest only at $3,496. Call it $3,500 a month.
Okay.
If we run the same scenario, same loan amount and everything else at 6.5 instead of 7.5, that payment drops down from $3,496 to $3,160, which is a $336 drop in payment. It's just what we've seen over the last few weeks here. Additionally, I wanted to run a couple other thoughts. We're seeing a lot of deals still come in, right? The vast majority, I'm saying 85% of everything we're seeing coming in right now has some sort of concessions from the seller, meaning closing costs paid by the seller. And the vast majority of the time, what I'm doing is I'm using those funds from the seller to obtain even lower interest rates. So what I did is I ran another scenario at 5.5%, same $500,000 loan amount, and that principal and interest payment goes all the way down to $2,838, which is a $658 drop from what we were seeing just a month or so ago.
Wow.
So really a huge drop in payment. The other thing that I looked at, this gets to be a lot of fun. In my world, we approve folks for mortgage payments based on payments, not sales price. Sure. Common misconception, everybody wants to know what they're approved for. And the dead honest truth is they're approved for a payment every month, DTI, debt to income scenarios. So if we're trying to sort of maximize, let's just go back to the first scenario and say that we had somebody approved at $3,500 a month in terms of principal and interest. At that 7.5% yielded roughly $500,000. Using the current scenario where we get funds from the seller to buy down, that takes the $3,500, what it was a month ago was $500,000. What it is now is $615,000. So somebody's buying power has literally gone up, somewhere in that ballpark, $100,000 to $115,000 over the last 30 days or so, presuming that we get some seller concessions to help them with the rate. So anyway, just thought that was really awesome information that we should share.
Assuming just say you're taking equity from home sale and you're putting down, just call it $200,000, borrowing $500,000, you're in a $700,000 house. But in this scenario, if you can get the seller to contribute to your permanent rate buy down, which means that permanently you're at a 5.5 is what we're talking about, right? Then now you're able to purchase up to an $815,000 house.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that everybody was sort of on lockdown when it comes to some of these rates that we've seen over the last year or so. And believe me, I totally get it. And some of these surveys that I'm seeing said, gosh, if rates were only in the fives, right? We're here. If we can get seller concessions, we're here. And I believe there's a ton of opportunity right now.
As we film this, we are about 17 to 15 days away, I think, from when the Fed meets again, and they're going to discuss whether or not they're going to drop rates. As we know, that doesn't necessarily always directly correlate to a mortgage rate drop, even if they were to drop the rate. And potentially that number is already baked in. The anticipation of that reduction in rate is potentially already baked into today's rates. So we're just taking what we know today, 6.5%, looking at that now. And with seller concessions added in there, you can potentially be in the fives, the mid fives, it sounds like, which is just amazing. What does it take? What kind of concessions, I know that every situation is different, but on average, like again, with the $500,000 loan amount, what kind of seller contributions would you have to have from the seller? Is it $10,000, 15, 20?
It's probably between 15 and 20.
So what we're looking at is
and again, every scenario is different, but
yeah. So, if a buyer, in other words, is making an offer on a place that's $700,000 and they're saying, please give me $15,000 to $20,000 back, right? That's, the seller should consider that rather than, like dropping their purchase price down to $680,000, for instance. They might pick up more buyers. It might be more attractive online, but what you'll end up with is a buyer that's a lot happier in that situation, because the buyer now can afford long-term to buy that much more of a home and have those rates long-term. So that 5.5 now is all of a sudden not that far from maybe their crazy 2.75 rate that they got a few years ago, or their 3.25 rate. There's still a big difference there, but it's not nearly as big of a gap as it was when it was over 8, just almost a year ago.
Yep, I would agree. And I also wanted to add too, just one little piece, and Matt, you and I have talked about this before, but and it's really easy to run the scenario. So if anybody is curious as to what the numbers look like, it's 10 times out of 10 going to be less expensive, quite a bit from a monthly payment standpoint, to get those concessions to receive a lower interest rate than it is in price. Mm-hmm. So, and a lot of agents don't even know this, right? So Matt, I'm glad that we get to work with you and your clients because you're very savvy and know these kind of things. But, if we look at a $700,000 versus a $680,000 sales price, hardly anything in payment. But if we look at what that $20,000 can do from a payment standpoint, I mean, it's roughly $350 a month. If we can get those concessions. So anyway, just something cool.
Well, and the conversation during the negotiation is, hey, seller, you could drop your price to 680, or you could keep it at 700. We sell this house now at 700,000, but you give us $20,000 in concessions so that the buyers can be happy, so that it's comfortably fits into their budget. And now all of a sudden you've got a real viable buying situation where somebody has a lot more ability. And it actually opens up your range of affordability, because when you if you were to drop down the price from 700 to 680, you might attract a few more people. When it comes down to the net proceeds that a seller would walk away from, if they give you $20,000 in concessions right from the top off of a $700,000 purchase price, or they come down in their purchase price and just say our asking price now is 680. That's exactly the same amount of net to them. But what they don't have is the ability to connect with that buyer and have a buyer that now it's so much more affordable. Because for a buyer to afford 680 versus 700,000, it only affects your payment just a little bit, right? But when we have this scenario where we say, give us the $20,000, we'll use them as concessions to buy it down to a rate that's in the mid fives. Now all of a sudden that buyer's got that mid fives rate potentially for the next 30 years. Which is a massive amount of difference. Is the whole point of this illustration is a massive difference in buyer buying power, which also helps the seller in this scenario, and is literally no different in terms of their net bottom dollar.
Yeah, I ran just a quick scenario. So the difference in dropping the sales price is about $100 a month. The difference in getting that big of an interest rate reduction is close to $350 a month.
Well, good. This illustration was literally just brought on as we think through these things practically. If you were to call Brian right now to ask him about certain scenarios, this is exactly what he would walk you through. And so that's what we're encouraging. Reach out to myself, reach out to Brian, and let's talk about certain scenarios to be able to help you through this and be able to see this rather than trying to figure this out on your own. We're just making some assumptions. This is an opportunity to actually get real numbers. As always, great to talk to you and great to work with you.
Thanks for having me, as always.
All right. We'll see you, Brian.